Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Pollard, the Project Officer for ERIC in the U.S. Department of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. Today we're going to talk about some updates we are proposing to the ERIC selection policy. These updates are intended to clarify and strengthen some of our existing policies and procedures and make them more transparent for content providers in the ERIC community. The updates are based on our team's experience implementing the selection policy on a day-to-day basis and take into account the feedback and questions that we've received from publishers, authors, and ERIC users. Before I get started, I have just a couple housekeeping items. First, we muted everyone to reduce the noise during our presentation. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat box on the side of your screen. We will address your questions or comments as we see them come in or at the end of our presentation during the Q&A session. We are also recording the webinar and will be available for viewing on YouTube in a few weeks with a link on the ERIC multimedia area. You'll get an email to let you know when it's online. We also closed caption the presentation. If you want to turn off the captioning, please click the X by the media viewer. Today you're going to hear from two members of the ERIC team, starting with me. I'll provide an introduction and a wrap-up. Then I'm going to turn it over to Fern Frusty, the Collection Development Lead, who's going to walk you through the proposed updates to the ERIC selection policy. We're going to provide some background on the ERIC selection policy, discuss why we periodically need to review and update the document, and then share this year's proposed updates. We'll close out our time together today by talking about the next steps leading up to the final revised version of the selection policy. The purpose of the selection policy is to articulate the ERIC Digital Library's policies and practices. The policy states our mission and overarching collection development goals, defines the standard and criteria required of approved sources and individuals submitting to the online submission system, lists the types of materials indexed in ERIC, and ends with a statement to express the importance of preserving the records and content in ERIC. The current selection policy can be found by clicking the Selection Policy link in the footer of the ERIC website. Today we're going to be referring to the proposed changes to the selection policy. You may want to have a copy open as we're going through this presentation. In the chat box below, you'll see that we're sending out a link to where you can download the proposed changes. You can also find the proposed changes by clicking on Notes in the upper right-hand corner of the ERIC website. Now I'd like to introduce Fern Frusty, who's going to walk you through the proposed updates.
Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everyone. We review the selection policy periodically to ensure that it continues to communicate current collection development policies and processes in a clear and understandable way. The last updates were revisions in January 2016 to the peer review policies section, requirements for multi-language journals, the addition of a preservation policy, and other minor edits. The primary focus and scope of ERIC does not change, but there are minor changes to our work processes over time, and we want to update the selection policy to be as transparent as possible about how ERIC operates. This year, our review primarily identified minor updates to improve clarity, but we are also proposing that we add some language to clarify or be more transparent about a few current working practices. Today, we will walk through the proposed updates to the policy. For your reference, the page number of the draft selection policy will be on the slide. Due to time constraints, I will not cover any update that is a very minor editorial change. However, please feel free to ask about any change during the Q&A time and send feedback to ericrequests@ed.gov. So let's begin on page 1 of the draft selection policy. The sentence on this slide is just the first sentence of the current mission statement. The complete mission statement is quite a bit longer, but an update is only proposed for the first sentence. The proposed update in blue font on your slide is a change only to the underlined portion of the sentence. The reason for the update is to make clear a possible misunderstanding. Our policy is that ERIC will only display the full text attached to an ERIC record when permission is explicitly granted by the publisher. It is possible that the full text is available on the publisher's site, but they may not grant permission for it to display in ERIC. For this reason, the proposed change to the underlined text would be when permission is granted, rather than when such text is freely available. Now we'll move on to the standard and criteria section. The selection standard criteria are included on pages 2 through 4 of the draft selection policy. The standard is that all materials indexed in ERIC must be directly related to the field of education, and there are no edits proposed to this section. The criteria used for source and material selection include quality, peer review, language, material format, publisher procedures, and sponsorship. I will review proposed updates to each. On page 2 of the draft selection policy, we are proposing an update to the definition of integrity, one of the 5 quality indicators. The current definition is true, but content delivery is adequately covered on page 6 among other operational requirements for approved sources. The proposed definition of integrity is, the material from a source under agreement must include the source name. The author's name must be on a document submitted to the ERIC online submission system. This better describes how we actually validate the integrity of the content as being published by a source under agreement, and what we require before we can accept a document through the online submission system. There is only a minor update proposed for the peer review section on page 3 of the draft selection policy. This update will align the language with our current working policies and with the ERIC online submission instructions. When we are determining if the content published by a source is peer-reviewed, ERIC will research the publisher's website or their content to consider their peer review policies and processes. ERIC accepts the information available on either. For the language criteria found on pages 3 and 4, the proposed update will add transparency to the benchmark for multi-language journals. Our current working practice is that 80% of the articles must be available in English in 3 recent issues before we will review the journal. We continue to receive a large number of requests to review multi-language journals. To make our working policy very clear to these publishers, we are proposing that in addition to adding the words "in 3 recent issues" to the first bullet, that we propose that we add the benchmark must continue to be met in future issues. The current criteria for material format is a fairly straightforward statement. However, we have found that electronic format can be interpreted broadly, and that some journals or reports have moved to a format we cannot process, for example, an interactive online format. The update on this slide is proposed for 2 reasons. First, to avoid the impression that we require the display of the full text in ERIC, and second, to list the electronic formats that we prefer to receive, including the PDF, the preferred ERIC XML format, or another XML format. We've identified several issues when reviewing new sources and would like to strengthen the language and the criteria of publisher and editorial procedures. We are proposing that it would be fine to remove the 3rd bullet, make a few minor edits, and add 3 statements to address other known issues identified when reviewing new journals. Sometimes publishers do not have all the information available on their website that we want to find when we review a new journal. On page 4 of the draft policy, we propose the following updates. For the 2nd bullet, we would like to see some reference to standards required by the publisher or editorial team, in addition to manuscript submission policy or process. For this reason, we are proposing the addition of the words "and standards required" in this bullet. We are proposing the removal of the 3rd bullet. We've already received some feedback that there is a concern about removing this statement. Our rationale is that while it would be ideal if all publishers made this level of information available, and we have found this information on the website for the large publishers, we rarely can find this level of policy detail for a small publisher. This makes this type of action less actionable than other updates are proposed for this section. We will certainly consider this feedback before a final decision is made. For the 4th bullet, we look for complete transparency on the part of the publisher as to the scholarly affiliation of editors as well as the reviewers. For this reason, we've added editors to the statement. For the bullet about selectivity, we are proposing an expansion of the definition. We have found a few instances where a journal, when approved, might publish 4 times a year and include the typical 6 to 8 articles in each issue. Then at some later time, they increase the number of issues, some as many as 12 or more per year, and may include as many as 25 articles per issue. This raises a flag, and we like to review the content again, as it may indicate that they are no longer being selective or not taking enough time for a rigorous editorial and peer review process. Then we are proposing the addition of 3 indicators that are actionable. First, we look for sources of funding or sponsorship. Second, when reviewing a new source, we look for a well-written aim and scope or mission statement and validate that the content they publish successfully reflects the statement. And third, that research is clearly presented and free of typographical errors. On to the next slide, please. Moving on to the next area in the selection policy, from pages 4 through 7, includes policies and procedures associated with approved sources of material under agreement that regularly provide material for indexing in ERIC. These are journals, book publishers, and the associations, organizations, and agencies that produce gray literature. We will review proposed updates to the source review process, the inclusion of records and material from the approved sources, and the policies and requirements of publishers after they sign an agreement. If you have the draft selection policy available, you will notice quite a bit of track changes on page 5. There is no change to the policies or procedures, but we are proposing that we rearrange the text to present the activities in the order they occur and incorporate the first paragraph into the appropriate step. This is to clarify and more accurately communicate the current procedures to identify and review sources of content. Then, all language about reviewing a currently indexed source to possibly discontinue it has been moved to its own paragraph at the end of this section. Because the source review and approval process section is lengthy and the proposed updates are primarily a reordering, I am showing you this section split between this and 2 other slides and without the track changes. If you would like to view the track changes, please follow along on page 5. To begin, the introductory paragraph has been moved to the source review process activities that will be shown on the next slide. Instead, we begin this section with the statements about the periodic collection analysis, which is conducted at any time. We rearranged the text slightly to improve readability, but have not removed or added any language. We first review the coverage of the ERIC topic areas by the number of sources. Then we look at the number of records per topic area, the number that are peer-reviewed, and if full text display is permitted in ERIC. This helps us to know we are meeting our stated goals. We also validate that all sources under agreement are actively publishing. Then we introduce the biannual review of new sources. Quite a bit of language from the introductory paragraph has been moved here, and we've added a new sentence at the end of the paragraph explicitly stating that anyone may nominate a source by sending an email to ericrequests@ed.gov. The steps to review news sources remain primarily the same. We begin by reviewing the current collection analysis and setting collection goals. We are often reviewing over 200 suggested sources in any review cycle. So the next step is to prioritize them by researching any information not yet gathered and reviewing background information and sample content to identify the strongest set of new sources to recommend. We've removed the bullet which was a step to collect information about candidate sources only because we now collect this information as soon as the source is suggested. Instead, we've added the review of background information to the work of prioritizing the suggested sources. The last 3 bullets remain basically the same, but the references to discontinuing content or notifying publishers if a source has been discontinued has been moved forward to a new paragraph at the end of this section. And here it is. For the last portion of the source review and approval process, we are proposing that we add a paragraph summarizing our current practice to reconsider sources under agreement. Despite a very rigorous review process to select sources for regular indexing in ERIC, we also have activities in place to make sure that the sources listed on our journal or non-journal source list continue to be in scope, current, and relevant to the ERIC collection. Sources may cease, merge, change their scope, or stop providing current content. For non-journal sources, some have become a resource rather than publish original content. All sources must continue to meet the standard and selection outlined in the selection policy. If the department determines that we should stop indexing a source, the publisher is notified and the indexing of their content will stop. Any records or content in ERIC will remain in ERIC. Now we'll move on to the coverage of approved journal sources. If we determine that at least 80% of the articles are education research, then we index it comprehensively. If less than 80%, then a manual article-by-article selection process is applied. For any journal not comprehensively indexed, we categorize them as selectively indexed if 50 to 79% of the articles were in scope for ERIC, and occasionally indexed if 25 to 49% of the articles were education-related. This third category was created in 2004 in order to index the occasional education-related article in an otherwise non-education-related publication. This helped us to be able to project the contribution of each journal to ERIC. Since 2013, all journals approved for indexing in ERIC contain 50% or more education-related articles, and for this reason, we are proposing to remove the occasional category. The currently approved sources are carefully reviewed and selected with the topic area coverage in mind. Because a minimum of 50% of their articles are education research, they will ensure that we meet our stated collection goals. This update would reflect our current working policy and also manage the expectations of publishers who request the review of a journal that has a low rate of education research content. Our grantees publishing in non-education journals may submit to ERIC using the online submission system. And certainly if a journal has slightly less than 50% in-scope articles, but is deemed to be critical to a topic area coverage, we could make an exception and index it as a selectively indexed journal. Now we will move on to the suggested updates for the area called Operational Requirements for Approved Sources. This is on pages 6 and 7 of the draft selection policy. Sources under agreement, both journal and non-journal sources, sometimes experience changes. We are proposing the addition of a new policy statement about how we handle source changes. If a source has a name change or is acquired by a new publisher, ERIC may review the source again when new content is published. If a source is acquired by a new publisher, ERIC must establish a new agreement to continue indexing. If, for example, a journal has a minor name change to reflect current terminology, most likely we will just validate the aim and scope and continue indexing new issues without pausing to go through a formal review process. However, if we notice that there is a shift in the aim and scope statement when they have this name change, we feel it is best to review new content when it is available. The acceptable methods of receiving or acquiring materials for indexing are on the publisher agreement form, but at this time they are not in the selection policy. The second update we proposed for the operational requirements area is to add examples of the current methods ERIC receives or acquires content for indexing. This includes secure FTP, emailing files to ERIC at ed.gov, or granting permission for ERIC to download content from the publisher. We'll next look at proposed updates on pages 7 and 8 of the draft selection policy for the information about the online submission system. The online submission system provides a way for grantees and other individual authors to submit a paper or a report to ERIC. It may also be used by an authorized representative of a program, commission, or initiative that have just a few documents. Because we also occasionally receive articles from a whole issue from editors or journals that are not selected for indexing, we want to remove any language that is redundant or may be misinterpreted. We have already stated that we will not accept content from an individual author, and this does include journal articles, but are proposing that we add an explicit statement that content may not be submitted by a journal editor or a publisher representative for the author. Next, on pages 7 and 8 of the draft selection policy, We list the types of material not accepted through the online submission system. We will soon be discussing a proposed table of materials not indexed in ERIC. Because the new table will fully capture all of the types of content not accepted, we are proposing in this area that we replace this paragraph with a sentence to refer readers to the complete table. On page 8 of the selection policy, we state that all individuals using the online submission system must grant ERIC rights to distribute the full text. This does not reflect how the display policy for IES grantees differs now from all other submitters. The proposed update retains the current language but separates out the rule of display for grantee content. Grantees must submit their final manuscript to ERIC, but this full text will not display until 12 months after it has been published in a journal. The content for all other submitters will display immediately. We also propose a change to this bullet format that will be easier to read. Starting on page 8 of the draft selection policy is a table of the types of material indexed in ERIC. There is no change to the introduction of this area. We seek to index journal articles, books, and gray literature, ranging from information briefs to substantive, rigorously researched and reviewed documents, conference papers, and policy reports. We reviewed every type of material in the table and are suggesting just a few changes. There's currently just one entry called Bibliographies and Literature Reviews. The proposed update would retain both but create separate entries for each type of material in the table. For books, we proposed simplifying the description and moving serial monographs to the entry for serial publications. We are proposing that the entry electronic publications be removed from the table. Our rationale is that this term is a carryover from years in the past. We certainly are indexing documents in an electronic format. This has been described in the criteria called material format, but we are not indexing content as described in this entry. Non-print media, such as videotapes, audio tapes, CD-ROMs, DVDs, or other electronically recorded or digitized information. There are 3 entries that begin federal or state. Because we are finding some research at the county or local level, we are proposing that we add or local to each of these 3 entries. We also added some specific type of documents we're finding for data profiles, strategic plans, and reports on school year and instructional time. And lastly, in this table, we have moved serial publications to be correctly listed alphabetically and propose changing the definition to list other types of serial content that we want to index. This would be serial monographs, yearbooks, proceedings, technical briefs, white papers, or other. And since we are no longer indexing individual newspaper articles, this has been removed from the entry. The current paragraph that describes the type of materials not indexed in ERIC is on this slide. We reviewed this at length and identified several other types of material we do not select when they are received via the online submission system or if they are produced by an approved non-journal source. We also found the paragraph format was difficult to read. To improve readability, we are proposing that we use a table format for this area that's similar to the one for materials we do index. And to increase transparency, we want to add all known types of content that we do not accept for indexing. You'll find the complete table on pages 10 and 11 of the draft selection policy. The alphabetical table format and the specific listing of materials will be easier for users, publishers, and staff to reference. We begin by mentioning that ERIC does not index subject matter content. This statement was carried forward from the current paragraph. We have added that we do not index professional education content as we received quite a few requests to index this type of material and it is out of scope for ERIC. Then we list the types of material that are not accepted for indexing in ERIC in alphabetical order. We begin with advertisements. We have annual budgets, audio tapes, book reviews, and booklets that describe a program or any content in electronic or digitized format. Due to the length of this table, it is continued now on the next 2 slides. Infographics. At this time, we are not indexing infographics because they typically do not contain enough content or evaluation of the information communicated to be of value over time. If there is some evaluation or an introduction, or they've included references, we consider the document to be a brief, and it would be acceptable to index in ERIC. ERIC only indexes substantive articles in a journal issue, so we are listing all types of journal content sometimes submitted to us that we do not index. We have found that some journal articles and even some reports are available only in an interactive online format. Because we cannot confirm that it is in a final form, this is not the type of content that we can index. And lastly, on this slide, the statement about lesson plans is exactly the same as the current paragraph from this section. This slide contains the last portion of the types of material not indexed in ERIC. This would be marketing materials, newsletters without substantive content, newspaper articles, poetry, slide presentations, spreadsheets of content, textbooks, videotapes, web content, and webinars. You can review the complete updated table in the draft selection policy. I know we're moving through all of this fairly quickly, but just a reminder, we will review and consider all your comments received at ERIC requests at ed.gov through November 3rd. On page 11 of the draft selection policy, we are proposing just a few updates to this paragraph. The selection policy will continue to be reviewed regularly to make sure that it accurately reflects the current working policies and procedures. Rather than every other year, we are proposing a change to on a periodic basis. This reflects our desire to have the flexibility to review it sooner if needed. Also, ERIC will always be transparent in any changes, and so we proposed adding a sentence that ERIC will post suggested changes to the website and will encourage feedback from the public about the suggested change. And the final section in this document is the preservation policy found on page 12. The ERIC collection of bibliographic records and material is certainly unique and historic. For this reason, we are proposing that we add language to this paragraph to stress the importance of having a stable, historic collection of education-related research content in ERIC. We receive a significant number of requests to remove content or the ERIC record for a variety of reasons. These requests are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and we will only delete a record or full text in very exceptional circumstances. And of course, ERIC will not become involved in a copyright dispute. And before I turn it back over to Erin for our wrap-up and question and answer session, I would like to personally thank all of you who took time away from your busy schedule to join us today. And now, Erin?
Great. Thank you so much for joining us to review the proposed updates. We will now look forward to your questions or comments about the proposed updates. Please continue to use the chat feature to enter your feedback. Okay, and we're going to look to see if we have received any questions, and we haven't so far, so we're just going to give it a minute or two. And while you're typing your questions, as a reminder, we're going to be soliciting your feedback on the proposed changes until November 3rd. So you can download the proposed changes by clicking on the Notes section in the upper right-hand corner of the ERIC website, or on the link that we have in the chat box. And you can send any feedback to ericrequests@ed.gov. So we're just going to give it another minute or two for questions. And if you have questions after this or that you don't want answered in a group setting, feel free to just email us at ericrequests@ed.gov. Okay, it looks like we must have done a very good job explaining because there's no questions. So we're going to take that as a compliment. And stay tuned to the multimedia page for the archived webinar and presentation. And we look forward to receiving any comments from little things to major changes, any pushback. Please send that by November 3rd. And we will be posting the revised selection policy on or around January 2018. We'll aim to have it up around the new year. Thank you. No, you're not too late to ask a question. We just got it through. Sorry. Okay, we are reading the question now. Can you scroll up? Okay. Back to when you were referring to the rare instances that we delete items. Yes. So I'm assuming that there's more to the question that is coming, but I will explain a little bit about what our deletion policy is. We only delete items when, with redacted art. All right, so this is the rest of the question. With redacted articles, could you leave them in and mark them as redacted as opposed to deleting the entry? Well, that is an interesting idea. And that certainly would have lots of advantages, because our concern as Eric, is, let's say you're a student, you download a PDF, you write your paper, and you cite it. And then, especially this is for undergraduates, it happens, but it's very frustrating as a graduate student. You go back to that link, and it's not there, and you can't find it, you can't cite it. What happened? It causes confusion about integrity. So this would be much more transparent. However, generally when things are redacted, publishers don't like us drawing attention to it. So we need to think more about that, and it would be great if you could write us an email with a little more information about your thoughts about this, because we're certainly going to take that information into account, but we will think more about that. Okay, and it looks like we got another question. Okay, and yes, so we have, and this is just a recommendation of a place to check out, and we will consult these guidelines. All right, so are there other questions? We'll just give it till 2:35. Yes, there is another question. Okay, let's see. Nope, that's just a comment, so thank you. All right, we'll give it another minute. All right, can we just see if anything else came in? Okay, that looks like everything else. So we look forward to receiving any comments or questions at ericrequest@ed.gov. And thank you so much today. Have a wonderful day.